Multiculturalism. Multi, which means many, or at least more than one. And culture. Now, what is that? Why don't we ask Twitter what that is? Oh, it's taco trucks, ethnic food. Oh, yeah. Oh, those white people and their mayonnaise, apparently. Oh, man. Now, of course, if culture is food, we don't really need multiculturalism. We just need cookbooks, right? And really, some cultures are definitely better than others, and will create some pretty massive cookbooks, particularly like the French, maybe the Japanese. But is culture really so shallow? Is it so surface as food? If we lost all of our current ingredients that we use in our culture and we had to use new ingredients, would that really be a huge cultural shift? I mean, come on, if Japan stopped eating rice, would it really be that much less like current Japan? I mean, rice is a big deal over there. After all, gohan is a word that not only refers to meal, it also means rice. But it would still be Japan without rice, wouldn't it? Now, of course, saying that culture is food is incredibly simplistic and possibly just kind of dumb. Now, there are tons of people online who have made this analogy, but I'll give it a shot too. Culture is like an iceberg. You can look at an iceberg, and it's real easy to underestimate what you're looking at, because up to like 90% of an iceberg's mass might be below the surface of the water. Food, how we style our hair, what color clothes we wear during certain times of year, that's the stupid crap on top. It's plainly visible, but if it were to change, it really wouldn't matter that much. But it's when you get below the surface that things get slightly more important. For example, culturally, what does it mean to be polite? How should a guest be treated when you invite them into your home? Now, how you treat a guest isn't as obvious as food on a table, but hello, that's how you treat people. If we're trying to describe life in a human society and culture, how we treat each other is kind of a big deal, and a lot bigger deal than the food that we happen to eat, don't you think? But why don't we really go deeper? Go to something that's much more important, closer to the heart. What does it mean to be obscene? Of course, it's important to know what's polite and impolite. For example, if you're impolite, you might not make many friends, but the obscene is what can enrage people. If you're impolite in a new culture, you might get asked to leave. If you're obscene, you might not be allowed to leave. You're plucking at some very sensitive strings. So when we're here in the depths, you will have cultural elements like what is obscene? What is justice? What is the separation between personal and public space? How important is privacy? How is conflict handled? What's a bigger cultural element to Japan? The fact that they highly value privacy, and when tourists take photos, like Japanese tourists take photos, they will actually block out the faces of other tourists to respect their privacy? Or the fact that they eat rice? Which matters more? Come on, let's be real here. And keep in mind, these things like justice, where do they come from? Or how are they measured and judged? They're handled in the brain, people. And guess what? Different races have different brains. Shocking, I know. How could we have the same brains when we don't even have the same brain cases? You can look at a skull and know it's of someone of a different race. Heck, even when we still have our faces and skin on top of our skull, we can still tell what skull is underneath. We can tell that an albino black person is black, even if their skin and hair is light. This is why, when you hear people who champion multiculturalism, when they're talking about multiculturalism, they don't talk about multiculturalism between American whites and Canadian whites, or Australian whites and New Zealand whites. They talk about multiculturalism, and they mean multiracialism. When they talk about multiculturalism, they show you a picture like this, because the differences are in our genetics, and that's a big part in our culture. Genetically similar groups are often just more culturally compatible and similar. All right, so I have a great idea. Let's take people of different cultures, aka let's take people of different races, and push them into the same place. Now, what could go wrong? Certainly, people who don't agree on what is and what isn't obscene will have a great time together. I can't imagine any difficulties coming from disagreements on privacy and personal space. Certainly, people who don't agree on what's fair and just will have a wonderful time sharing a legal system. You can't even make laws and courts that apply to everybody satisfactorily. So let's break it down real quick. Let me try and make this very clear. The left circle is Group A, Culture A. Doesn't matter who they are. They have things that they consider obscene and they want banned. The right circle is Group B. They have what they consider obscene and want banned. Now, Section 2, in the middle, must be banned in this sort of multicultural society. If you don't ban it, both groups will be very angry and they'll feel the laws are permitting obscene behavior, and that's just not a stable situation, right? When everyone agrees that the laws need to change, they'll change somehow, that's for sure, so it's not stable. Now, Section 1, what about that, though? Group A wants it banned. They say if you don't ban it, you're permitting obscene behavior, and it will piss them off, right? But when you do ban it, Group B does get annoyed. That they feel like they're being limited and prohibited from engaging behavior that they think should be available to them. Now, Section 3 is the inverse, but it's even more annoying to Group A than the previous example because it's so much of a bigger limit on their behavior. So if Group A and Group B are both 50-50 of the population, what's going to happen? Well, Section 2 is definitely going to get banned. Section 1 might get banned, and Section 3 probably won't get banned. You'd have to see. And if you tried banning all three, everyone would agree that the government has gone too far and is being too restrictive. Both Group A and Group B are being restricted from things that they don't want to be. So if everyone agrees that there's too many laws, you're also in an unstable situation. They don't agree on what laws need to go, but if everyone agrees that there's too much, you can't stay there forever. But what if they just lived separately? Hey, think about that. A gets to ban both 1 and 2, B gets to ban 2 and 3, and they live happily ever after. Neither of them have to get limited from some other group's value of obscenity, and they don't have to impose what they want on other people. And you might know this. There is a saying, and it's good fences make good neighbors. Because it's easy to put up with someone that's very different from you for an evening or a weekend, but sometimes it's hard to put up with someone forever. Lots of us can get along if we're not trying to push incompatible people together permanently. Diversity, it's just so wonderful. So wonderful that people don't want it. But really, diversity is not preserved by pushing people together. It's preserved by keeping people apart, where they don't have their values and their lifestyle stepped on by some other culture's values, right? For example, let's take a history lesson here. Blast from the past. Lincoln understood what I just explained, right? Here's a quote from Lincoln. "I am not, nor have ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the black and white races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." So let's look at that carefully. Now, what would it mean if blacks became jurors, voters, and held office in a white country like the United States? Well, they could politically impose their culture on whites. If one group imposes their culture on another, they are superior in Lincoln's sense, right? He said the superior and the inferior. The superior is the one who gets to dictate politically what's happening, and the inferior one has to live under that plan, right? So this is why Lincoln tried to convince blacks to leave the United States after the Emancipation Proclamation. He supported blacks going to Liberia in Africa, and he also contracted that island off of Haiti so blacks could move there, because just think about it. If blacks live together without others, they don't have to be subject to someone else's culture. If they leave, they don't need to abide by our sense of justice. They don't have to be inhibited by our view of private space and obscenity. Instead, if they live with each other in their own land, they get to put exactly the kind of rules they want in place, even if it's something that we wouldn't support, right? Because they don't have to fight us just to get their own cultural sense of fairness to be law where they live. Now, does that make sense? Because I kind of think it does. And you know who else understood this? Malcolm X. He said, quote, "Our people should be allowed to go back to our own homeland, that the government itself should supply us with transportation." And he also mentioned that we need to give them all the machines to get agriculture started. And then he continued, "Since we cannot live in peace together mixed up on this continent." Gee, it's almost like people used to understand the reality that is plainly in front of our faces, but somehow we've convinced ourselves it's not real. I just want to say this. You can't advocate for multiracialism, but then complain about the conflict that comes from multiracialism. All these news stories about evil white women calling the police on blacks is multiculturalism. This is what you wanted. Well, it's not exactly what you wanted, but it's what you're asking for when you ask for multiculturalism. Different standards of behavior coming into constant conflict is multiculturalism. Remember, defend diversity, real diversity, a separate place for every race.